Marcus held his newborn son for the first time in the sterile hospital room, counting 10 perfect fingers and 10 perfect toes. The baby's eyes were wide open, dark and curious, searching for something in the bright fluorescent lights above. His wife Sarah smiled weakly from the bed, exhausted but radiant. They named him Daniel, after Marcus's grandfather who had taught him that strength comes from facing what you cannot change. The first few months passed in a blur of sleepless nights and endless diaper changes. But something felt different. Daniel never startled at loud noises. When Marcus would come home from work and slam the door, other babies would cry. Daniel remained peaceful, sleeping through thunderstorms and barking dogs. Sarah noticed it first. She would clap her hands behind Daniel's head, and he wouldn't turn around. She tried rattles, music boxes, her own voice calling his name. Nothing. The pediatrician's office smelled like antiseptic and false hope. Dr. Patterson ran the tests with gentle efficiency, placing headphones over Daniel's tiny ears, watching for responses that never came. Marcus watched the doctor's face carefully, searching for any sign of good news. There was none. The diagnosis arrived like a hammer blow: profound bilateral sensory neural hearing loss. Daniel was deaf. He would never hear his mother's lullabies, his father's laughter, or the sound of rain against the window. Marcus felt the world tilt beneath his feet. He had planned everything for his son. Little league baseball, teaching him to ride a bike, father-son fishing trips where they would talk about life and dreams. How do you have those conversations in silence? How do you comfort a child who can't hear your voice telling him everything will be okay? The questions multiplied in his mind like fractures spreading through glass. Sarah cried for 3 days straight. Marcus couldn't cry. He felt hollow, carved out from the inside. He researched obsessively, reading medical journals until his eyes burned, joining online forums for parents of deaf children, learning about cochlear implants and hearing aids and sign language. The information overwhelmed him like a tidal wave, each new fact another reminder of how unprepared he was for this journey. His co-workers offered sympathy he didn't want. His mother suggested they pray harder. His brother said Daniel would be fine, that deaf people live normal lives, but Marcus heard the uncertainty in his voice. Everyone had opinions, but nobody had answers. Nobody could tell him how to be the father his son needed. The night after the diagnosis, Marcus sat in Daniel's nursery watching him sleep. The baby's chest rose and fell in perfect rhythm, peaceful and unaware of the challenges ahead. Marcus thought about all the sounds his son would never experience. Music. Birds singing at dawn. The ocean's roar. His grandfather's deep laugh. The crack of a baseball bat. His own voice saying, "I love you, son." But then something shifted in Marcus's chest. He looked at Daniel's face, so peaceful in sleep, and realized something profound. His son wasn't broken. His son was simply different. Daniel would experience the world in ways Marcus could never fully understand. He would see things others missed. He would feel vibrations and read faces with extraordinary precision. He would communicate with his hands, his expressions, his whole body. It wouldn't be the life Marcus had imagined, but it would be Daniel's life, unique and valuable and worth fighting for. Marcus made a decision that night. He would learn everything. He would become fluent in American Sign Language. He would connect with the deaf community. He would give Daniel every tool, every opportunity, every chance to thrive. More importantly, he would learn to see deafness not as a tragedy to overcome, but as a different way of being human. He would teach Daniel pride, not shame. Confidence, not fear. He placed his hand gently on Daniel's chest, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath his palm. Words didn't matter in that moment. This connection, this love, this commitment to walk whatever path lay ahead, that was something that transcended sound. Marcus didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he would do whatever it took to give his son a beautiful life. The journey was just beginning, and Marcus was ready to face it, one silent step at a time. The sign language classes met every Tuesday and Thursday evening in a cramped community center that smelled like old coffee and determination. Marcus arrived early for the first session, clutching a notebook and 3 different pens, his palms sweating with nervous energy. The instructor, a deaf woman named Maria, stood at the front of the room with a confidence that filled the space. She didn't speak. She signed, and her interpreter voiced her words with practiced precision. Marcus struggled. His fingers felt thick and clumsy, unable to form the shapes that came so naturally to others. The alphabet alone took him 3 weeks to master. He practiced constantly, signing letters to himself in the bathroom mirror, in his car during lunch breaks, at his desk when he should have been working. Sarah joined him in the classes, and together they would practice conversations in their living room, fumbling through basic phrases about food and weather and feelings. Daniel was 6 months old when Marcus signed his first complete sentence to him. The baby was in his high chair, mashing bananas into his hair with gleeful abandon. Marcus positioned himself where Daniel could see him clearly and signed, "I love you." His hands moved through the motions Maria had taught him, pointing to himself, crossing his arms over his chest, then pointing to Daniel. The baby stared at him, banana-covered fingers frozen in midair. Then Daniel smiled, that huge toothless grin that made Marcus's heart explode with joy. But learning sign language was only the beginning. Marcus discovered an entire world he had never known existed. The deaf community had its own culture, its own history, its own art and poetry and humor. He attended deaf events, sitting awkwardly on the periphery at first, watching conversations flow in graceful hand movements he could barely follow. People were patient with him, slowing down their signs, repeating themselves, encouraging his efforts. Slowly, he began to understand that deafness wasn't about what was missing. It was about what was different, and different could be beautiful. Marcus met Robert at one of these events, a deaf man in his 50s who had raised 3 hearing children. Robert became his mentor, teaching him not just signs but the nuances of deaf culture. He explained that many deaf people don't view themselves as disabled or broken. They are simply members of a linguistic minority, as valid as any other. This perspective revolutionized Marcus's thinking. He stopped mourning the son he thought he would have and started celebrating the son he actually had. The challenges multiplied as Daniel grew. Medical appointments became logistical nightmares. Early intervention specialists came to their home 3 times a week, working with Daniel on language development and cognitive skills. Insurance companies denied claims. Equipment was expensive. The audiologist recommended hearing aids, though they would provide limited benefit given the severity of Daniel's hearing loss. Marcus and Sarah had to decide about cochlear implants, a choice that divided even the deaf community. They researched for months, attending seminars and talking to families who had chosen implants and families who hadn't. Some deaf adults were adamant that implants were unnecessary, that sign language was enough, that trying to fix deafness sent the wrong message to deaf children. Others praised the technology for providing access to sound and spoken language. Marcus lay awake at night, terrified of making the wrong choice, of failing his son before his life had really begun. They decided to wait. Daniel was healthy and happy, meeting his developmental milestones through sign language. They would let him be part of the decision when he was older, if he wanted implants. For now, they would focus on giving him a strong foundation in ASL and connecting him with other deaf children and adults who could serve as role models. Marcus's world had transformed completely. He thought in sign language now. He noticed everything visual, the play of light on walls, the expressions on faces, the way people moved through space. He became attuned to vibrations and found himself watching people's mouths even when they spoke to him. His hearing friends didn't understand the changes in him. They made jokes about learning a few signs, but never followed through. Some drifted away, uncomfortable with the extra effort required to include Daniel in conversations. But new friends emerged. Other parents of deaf children. Deaf adults who welcomed Marcus into their community with open arms. His world became smaller in some ways but infinitely richer in others. He learned deaf jokes, deaf history, the politics of captioning and accessibility. He learned to value silence not as emptiness but as space for other forms of communication. Daniel thrived. At 18 months, he was signing over 50 words. He had favorite signs, more for more snacks, play for playtime, daddy, which he signed with enthusiastic exaggeration. Marcus video called Sarah from work just to see Daniel sign to him through the screen. These moments filled him with a pride so fierce it sometimes brought tears to his eyes. His son was brilliant, communicative, and joyful. The silence that had once terrified Marcus had become the backdrop for the most meaningful conversations of his life. Daniel's 3rd birthday party should have been a celebration, but it became the day Marcus realized how hostile the world could be to his son. They had invited neighborhood kids to a local playground, excited to see Daniel interact with other children. Marcus had even hired a deaf entertainer who performed stories in sign language, hoping it would introduce the other kids to Daniel's world. Most of the parents made excuses. Their children were sick, they said, or had other commitments. Only 3 kids showed up, and their parents stood at a distance, checking their phones, clearly uncomfortable. Marcus watched as Daniel tried to play with the other children, signing enthusiastically, his face bright with excitement. The kids stared at him like he was an alien. One little girl started crying and ran to her mother. Another boy laughed and made random hand gestures, mocking Daniel's signs. The 3rd child simply walked away. Marcus felt rage building in his chest like a volcano preparing to erupt. Sarah grabbed his arm, her fingernails digging into his skin, holding him back. Daniel didn't notice at first. He was too focused on the deaf entertainer, laughing at the visual comedy, completely absorbed. But eventually, he looked around and realized he was alone. The confusion on his face broke Marcus's heart into 1,000 pieces. That night, after Daniel was asleep, Marcus and Sarah had their first real fight about their son's future. Sarah wanted to move to a city with a larger deaf community, maybe near a deaf school where Daniel could have deaf friends and teachers who signed. Marcus resisted. He had a good job here. Their families were here. Why should they uproot their entire lives? Why should Daniel be the one who had to adapt? But deep down, Marcus knew Sarah was right. The neighborhood school district had already told them that Daniel would need to attend a special program 30 minutes away. There would be an interpreter, they said, as if that solved everything. But Daniel would be the only deaf student. He would spend his days watching an interpreter translate what everyone else heard naturally. He would always be the outsider, the different one, the kid who needed accommodation. Marcus started noticing the barriers everywhere. Restaurants with dim lighting where Daniel couldn't see people signing. Movie theaters without caption showings. Birthday parties at loud arcades where communication was impossible. Family gatherings where everyone talked at once and nobody bothered to include Daniel in conversations. His own mother would coo at Daniel in baby talk, forgetting that he couldn't hear her, that she needed to sign. When Marcus reminded her, she would shrug helplessly and say she was trying, but sign language was hard. The pediatrician's waiting room became a battleground. Other parents would stare at Daniel, whispering to each other. Once, a mother actually moved her child away when Daniel tried to play with the waiting room toys, as if deafness might be contagious. Marcus confronted her, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. The woman claimed she was just being cautious, that she didn't understand why Daniel was making strange noises. Marcus realized she was talking about Daniel's vocal stimming, the sounds he made because he couldn't hear himself. Work became increasingly difficult. Marcus's boss was understanding at first, but patience wore thin when Marcus had to leave early for Daniel's therapy appointments or take calls from teachers or doctors. His colleagues stopped inviting him to after-work events. They said it was because he always talked about Daniel's deafness, that he had become obsessive. Marcus wanted to scream at them that they had no idea what it was like to fight for your child's basic inclusion every single day. The breaking point came at a family wedding. Daniel was 4 years old, verbal in sign language, bright and curious and full of life. But at the reception, he was seated at a corner table while other kids ran around the dance floor. Nobody tried to communicate with him. When Marcus asked the DJ to play music with strong bass so Daniel could feel the vibrations and dance, his uncle complained that Marcus was making everything about Daniel's disability. The word stung. Disability. As if Daniel was less than whole. Marcus found himself in the parking lot, sitting in his car, hands shaking with exhaustion and frustration. He thought about all the battles ahead. School fights about accommodations. Social events where Daniel would be excluded. Job opportunities that might not come because of prejudice. Dating, relationships, the casual cruelty of teenagers. How was he supposed to protect his son from all of this? How could one father fight against an entire world built for hearing people? Sarah found him there an hour later. She didn't say anything at first, just climbed into the passenger seat and held his hand. They sat in silence, the comfortable silence they had learned to appreciate, the silence that meant they understood each other without words. Finally, Sarah signed what Marcus had been thinking: we can't change the world. But we can change our world. The decision crystallized in that moment. They would move. Not to run away, but to run toward something better. They would find a community where Daniel wouldn't be the only deaf child, where sign language was valued, where their son could see deaf adults thriving in careers and relationships in life. They would sacrifice their comfort to give Daniel something more precious: belonging. Marcus looked at Sarah, this woman who had transformed alongside him, who had become fierce and protective and wise. They had been changed by Daniel's deafness in ways they never anticipated. They had lost friends but gained deeper connections. They had faced their own prejudices and limitations. They had learned that love sometimes means letting go of the life you plan to embrace the life that is. That night, Marcus began researching cities with strong deaf communities, schools for the deaf, neighborhoods where signing was common. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time since Daniel's diagnosis, Marcus felt something like hope. They were going to give their son a fighting chance, even if it meant fighting the whole world. Daniel was 7 years old when it happened. They had been living in their new city for 2 years, near the state school for the deaf. Daniel attended a bilingual program where half the students were deaf and all the teachers signed. He had friends now, real friends who communicated effortlessly in his language. Marcus watched his son blossom with a joy that made every sacrifice worth it. It was a Saturday morning, early spring, and Marcus was in the kitchen making pancakes. Daniel sat at the table drawing pictures of robots and spaceships, his tongue poking out in concentration the way it always did when he focused. Sarah was at a yoga class, enjoying her rare moment of solitude. The house was peaceful, filled with the kind of comfortable quiet that Marcus had learned to treasure. Marcus was flipping a pancake when he saw Daniel's head snap up suddenly. His son's eyes went wide, his whole body going rigid with attention. Marcus's first thought was fear. Was something wrong? Was Daniel hurt? But Daniel wasn't looking at him. He was staring at the window, his expression one of absolute wonder, as if he was seeing something miraculous. Marcus followed his son's gaze but saw nothing unusual. Just the backyard, the fence, the neighbor's cat prowling through the grass. He signed to Daniel, asking what was wrong. Daniel didn't respond. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor, and walked toward the window like he was in a trance. His small hand pressed against the glass, and his mouth opened in an expression Marcus had never seen before. Then Daniel did something that made Marcus's blood run cold. His son turned to him and spoke. Not signed, spoke. The word was garbled, unclear, the voice of someone who had never heard their own speech. But Marcus understood it, bird. The pancake burned on the stove. Marcus stood frozen, the spatula dangling from his hand. Daniel was deaf. Profoundly, completely deaf. He had been tested multiple times. There was no residual hearing. None. This wasn't possible. But Daniel was still staring out the window, and his lips moved again, forming another word Marcus couldn't quite understand. Marcus rushed to his son, dropping to his knees in front of him. He signed frantically, "What did you see? What did you hear?" Daniel looked confused by his father's intensity. He signed back slowly, "I saw the bird singing. In my head. I could see the sounds." Marcus didn't understand. He asked Daniel to explain, but his son struggled to find the signs for what he was experiencing. It was like seeing colors, Daniel signed, but the colors were sounds. He could see them coming from the bird's beak, rippling through the air like waves in water. He could see the patterns, the rhythms, the way the sound moved and changed. This had to be imagination, Marcus thought. Children Daniel's age had vivid fantasies. But something in his son's eyes told him this was different. This was real, even if it made no scientific sense. Marcus grabbed his phone and started recording as Daniel described what he was experiencing. The bird sang again, and Daniel's face lit up. He pointed excitedly, describing the colors he saw, using signs for bright, pattern, moving, beautiful. When Sarah came home, Marcus showed her the video. She watched it 3 times, her face cycling through disbelief, confusion, and something that might have been fear. They called Daniel's audiologist, who ordered immediate testing. The test showed what they already knew: Daniel was deaf. Completely deaf. There was no change in his hearing whatsoever. The audiologist suggested it was synesthesia, a neurological condition where senses cross-wire. But synesthesia involving hearing in someone who couldn't hear? That was unprecedented. Marcus began documenting everything. He bought special cameras, journals, anything to track what Daniel was experiencing. His son could see different sounds as different visual patterns. A dog barking looked different from a car honking. Music created elaborate moving shapes that Daniel could follow with his eyes. He couldn't hear these sounds, but somehow his brain was perceiving them visually. The scientific community was skeptical when Marcus reached out to researchers. One neurologist agreed to study Daniel, fascinated by the possibility of a unique form of sensory compensation. Dr. Chen ran countless tests, brain scans, visual response measurements. What she found was remarkable. Daniel's visual cortex showed unusual activity patterns when exposed to sound vibrations, even though he couldn't consciously hear them. His brain had somehow rewired itself to convert acoustic information into visual data. Marcus felt like he was standing on the edge of something profound. His son wasn't just adapting to deafness, he was experiencing the world in a way no one had documented before. Daniel could see conversations happening in other rooms by watching the visual patterns sound made traveling through walls. He could identify people by the unique visual signature of their footsteps. He knew when someone was approaching from behind because he could see the sound waves their movement created. But this gift came with challenges. Daniel became overwhelmed in loud environments where too many visual sound patterns competed for his attention. Shopping malls were nightmares of overlapping colors and shapes. He started having headaches from the sensory overload. Marcus and Sarah had to learn new ways to help their son navigate this ability they barely understood. The deaf community had mixed reactions. Some were fascinated, calling Daniel special, gifted. Others were uncomfortable, worried that this discovery would be used to suggest deaf people were lacking something, that they needed to be fixed or enhanced. Marcus understood their concerns. He had fought hard to accept Daniel's deafness not as a deficiency but as a difference. Now he had to integrate this new reality. His son was deaf and he had an ability that seemed almost superhuman. Daniel himself seemed unbothered by the attention. He was more interested in drawing what he saw, creating elaborate pictures of sound patterns that looked like abstract art but represented actual acoustic events. Marcus watched his 7-year-old son fill sketchbook after sketchbook with these visual representations of sound, each one unique and beautiful. One night, as Marcus was tucking Daniel into bed, his son signed something that changed everything. "I'm not different because I'm deaf, Daddy. I'm different because I'm me. This is just how I see the world. Everyone sees it differently." Marcus realized his son was right. They had been so focused on Daniel's deafness, on accommodations and challenges and barriers, that they had almost missed the most important truth. Daniel was extraordinary not despite his deafness, but because of who he was as a complete person. The visual sound perception wasn't compensation for hearing loss. It was just another aspect of his son's unique neurology, as much a part of him as his brown eyes or his love of robots. The research continued, but Marcus stopped treating it as something that needed to be explained or solved. Instead, he simply documented his son's experience, preserved these moments of wonder, and supported Daniel in navigating his complex perceptual world. Whatever this ability was, it belonged to Daniel. It was his to explore, his to share or keep private, his to integrate into his identity. Daniel was 12 years old when he changed someone's life, and in doing so, showed Marcus the true meaning of their journey. The middle school Daniel attended was hosting a science fair, and students could present projects in either spoken English or ASL. Daniel had decided to present his visual sound perception research, 5 years of documented experiences, drawings, and patterns he had learned to recognize and interpret. Marcus helped him set up the booth, arranging the elaborate charts and sketchbooks Daniel had filled over the years. Each drawing was labeled with what sound it represented: laughter, thunder, music, crying, wind through trees. The patterns were mesmerizing, swirling shapes and colors that seemed to move across the page even though they were static images. Other students walked by, curious but uncertain, unsure how to engage with the deaf kid in his weird art project. Then Emma arrived. She was a 7th grader from the hearing program, confident and popular, the kind of kid who seemed to navigate middle school effortlessly. But she stopped at Daniel's booth and stared at his drawings with an intensity that caught Marcus's attention. She stood there for 10 minutes, just looking, her face cycling through emotions Marcus couldn't quite read. Finally, she signed to Daniel, slowly and carefully, "Can I ask you something?" Daniel was surprised but pleased. He signed back, "Yes, what?" Emma's hands moved hesitantly through the signs. "Your drawings. The one you labeled crying. That pattern, those shapes. I've seen that before. Not with sounds. With pain." Marcus watched as Daniel's expression shifted to understanding. Emma continued signing, her story pouring out in careful, deliberate movements. She had chronic migraines, debilitating headaches that had plagued her since she was 8. When the pain came, she saw patterns, swirling, pulsing visual distortions that doctors called auras. She had tried to draw them once, to explain to her neurologist what she experienced, but she could never quite capture it. Until she saw Daniel's drawings. The pattern Daniel had labeled as crying was almost identical to what Emma saw during her migraines. She pulled out her phone and showed Daniel photographs of her own attempted drawings. They were remarkably similar, the same spiraling motion, the same fragmented edges, the same sense of movement and intensity. Daniel's eyes went wide. He signed rapidly to Emma, asking questions about when she saw the patterns, how long they lasted, what they felt like. Marcus watched his son transform into a young scientist, comparing notes with Emma, finding connections between her migraine auras and his visual sound perceptions. They discovered that both experiences involved the visual cortex processing information in unusual ways. Emma's brain was responding to neurological distress, Daniel's was responding to acoustic vibrations. But the visual output was strikingly similar. Emma asked if she could work with Daniel, if they could present a joint project next year comparing their experiences. Daniel agreed immediately, thrilled to find someone who understood what it was like to see the invisible. Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes as he watched these two kids connect over their unique perceptual experiences, finding commonality in their differences. But the real miracle came 2 weeks later. Emma called their house, asking if she could visit. She arrived with her mother and a large portfolio. In the living room, she spread out dozens of drawings, each one a pattern she had seen during her migraines, now precisely rendered after studying Daniel's techniques. Her neurologist had been amazed. For the first time, Emma could accurately communicate what she was experiencing. The doctor could now see correlations between specific visual patterns and different types of migraine episodes, leading to more targeted treatment. Emma's mother was crying as she thanked Marcus and Daniel. For 4 years, she had felt helpless watching her daughter suffer through pain she couldn't understand. Now, because of Daniel's gift, because of his unique way of perceiving and documenting sensory experiences, her daughter finally had a voice for something that had been invisible and inexplicable. Daniel signed something to Emma that made Marcus's heart swell with pride. Everyone experiences the world differently. That's not wrong. That's just being human. When we share our experiences, we help each other understand. Emma hugged Daniel, and Marcus saw his son's face light up with joy, the pure happiness of being understood and of understanding someone else. The science fair project won first place the next year. But more importantly, it sparked something bigger. Dr. Chen, the neurologist who had been studying Daniel, connected Emma with a research program studying migraine auras. Emma's detailed drawings, refined with techniques learned from Daniel, became part of a database helping doctors understand visual disturbances associated with neurological conditions. Daniel's unique perception had created a new language for describing visual experiences that existed at the edge of typical human awareness. Marcus watched his son grow into a young man who understood that his differences were strengths, that his unique perspective had value beyond what anyone had imagined. Daniel started an online community for people with unusual perceptual experiences, synesthetes, people with visual snow, individuals with sensory processing differences. He created tutorials on how to document and communicate sensory experiences that were difficult to describe in words alone. On Daniel's 13th birthday, Marcus took him to the beach where they had scattered his grandfather's ashes years before. They sat on the sand, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that Marcus could only see and Daniel could see and feel as vibrations through the ground. Marcus signed to his son, "I'm sorry." Daniel looked confused. "For what?" Marcus's hands moved slowly through the explanation. "When you were born, I mourned the son I thought I would have. I was afraid of your deafness. I saw it as something to overcome. I didn't understand that you weren't missing anything. You were exactly who you were supposed to be." Daniel smiled and signed back, "You learned though. You changed. You fought for me. You gave me everything I needed to be myself." Then he added something that made Marcus laugh and cry at the same time. "Besides, if I could hear, I wouldn't be able to see sounds. And how boring would that be?" Marcus understood now what he hadn't known 13 years ago in that hospital room. Daniel's deafness wasn't a tragedy. It wasn't something to be fixed or overcome or accommodated. It was simply one part of who his son was, a brilliant, creative, compassionate young man who experienced the world in extraordinary ways. The journey hadn't been about Daniel learning to live in a hearing world. It had been about Marcus learning to see the world through his son's eyes. They sat together as the sun disappeared below the horizon, father and son, connected not by sound but by something deeper, understanding, acceptance, and love that transcended any form of communication. Daniel pointed to the waves and began signing, describing the patterns of sound color he saw in the ocean's rhythm, painting pictures with his hands of things Marcus could never perceive but could now appreciate through his son's unique vision. And Marcus realized that this exact moment, was the life he had been meant to live all along. Not the one he had planned, but the one his son had taught him to see.